Hello, everyone. Um, so, after having covered enough openings, I think for the time being, I wanted to move on to the next aspect of things that I think are critical for improving at chess. So, I've chosen to tackle tactics and calculation today. In general, I believe there are five main areas that you need to master in order to become a very strong player. These are tactics and calculation, number one. Um, Quite probably the most important area of the game. The second one is positional and strategic themes. These include things such as isolated pawns, um, piece activity, coordination, attack, defense, counterattack, those kind of things. A third thing is endgames, which we'll also do some sessions on. Endgames are very important, but they will probably become increasingly important as you get stronger and stronger. At the level that most club players are, a basic understanding of endgames and how to convert and defend them is probably sufficient. The fourth thing, which is a little sort of separate from the above, is sort of time management, which we'll sort of cover through sort of overriding themes, because obviously you only get a finite amount of time for your game, so you can't spend all your time in one critical moment. And we'll cover a little bit of time management today. And then the fifth thing is openings and opening principles, which sort of speaks for itself. That's sort of what we've covered so far. So we've kind of covered one of the five areas, and we're going to move on to cover other areas as well. I mean, that's just my personal philosophy on what you need to improve in order to get better. And there's many ways you can understand. I'd also like to say that these are all positive things you can add to your game. Within each of these topics, there'll be both things you need to learn, so positives you can add, and also negatives, things that you do badly that you can learn to undo, hopefully. And quite often, removing a negative can have as much, if not a better effect. Say, for example, you're in time trouble all the time, so you don't get a chance to think during critical moments. That will affect your results more adversely than learning to calculate perfectly. It doesn't matter how perfectly you can calculate if you never have any time in which to do so. Anyway, that's enough rambling. I will go through what I think is the best way to improve in tactics and calculation now. I've kind of broken this down to five steps. First thing, I don't think actually controversially calculation is that important until you reach a level of at least 1600 ECF. I think below this level, you can get by quite easily on short tactical sequences, 2 to 3 moves as an absolute maximum. But in order to reach this level, there are five sort of, well, I say five things, but I've split them into five. You just need to basically spot basic tactical patterns. Mating patterns, the most basic, which I'm sure we all know, being, say, let's just put this on the board real quick. Scholar's mate. That would be a typical mating device pattern. Attacking themes, I'm talking about attacks on the king side, Greek gift sacrifices on h7 with the bishop, that sort of thing. Defensive themes, I'm speaking about eliminating attacking pieces. Equally, this could be slightly strategically minded, but generally there are some tricks like stalemate tricks, which are all sort of fill as your defensive themes and pattern. Piece themes being like specific. So, for example, the knight is very good at forks. The bishop is good at skewers. The queen is good at almost everything. So, for example, long distance attacks. The rooks for skewers. Pawns. Oops. Let's use this pawn. Pawns for forks. And they're sort of piece themes and pawn themes. With pawn themes as well, you have all of your sort of en passant themes, promotion themes, lots of other types of themes that come into play in the end game as well. So how do you learn these things? Okay. So I've come up with 3 books that I really, really like. First of all is the 1001 Exercise series by Frank Erwick. I'd start with the beginners one. Actually, I think just the advanced one is by Frank Erwick. But this is an excellent book. You can see that it basically goes through all the basic patterns. If I go to you can even get it on Chessable, but if I go to, for example, the somebody's very kindly done a study of it. You can get some of this stuff, as you can see, free on Lichess. You can see here, for example, and you can try and solve some of this stuff. So like mates in 1. There'll be all of the checkmates that you need. This one's bishop f6, for example. This one is rook f7. So it'll go through all of your checkmates in 1. And you have other things here. It looks like the guy who did this sort of ran out and didn't do all of them. But yeah, 1001 chess exercises for beginners. There's also 1001 chess exercises for club players, which is excellent. And there's 1001 exercises for advanced club players, which I have, which is also excellent. And it just keeps going through things in themes. So these 2 books, start with this one. It's too easy, do this one. And then once you've done that, you can do the advanced one, which is a sort of red colour. Okay. If you really want to understand basic tactical patterns and the anatomy of tactics, why they work, why they don't, this very good book by Martin Vestechnik, Chess Tactics from Scratch, comes highly recommended. You can see it gets nearly 5 stars, and you can get this from I think the publisher is Gambit, probably. So it gives you the underlying principles of how tactics work, and again, it's structured. It's best for players around this 1500 elo and below. And it's very clear explanations of how tactics work. Would highly recommend. Well, I haven't read that one myself. I have read this one. And one that I like when you've moved on from these sort of 2 levels is the Ultimate Chess Puzzle Book by John Ems, which I've got as I used to read this on the train. I've got it as a Kindle version. Gambit publication puzzle books are generally really, really good, actually, I would say. So it's a very large collection, and it goes all the way up to advanced level. That's what it looks like. It's an excellent book. It's probably my favourite puzzle book I've ever read. If you want more difficult things, you can look at John Dunn's puzzle book, for example, as well. But I really like this one by John Ems. Okay, and then once you're sort of got to a level where you can solve, I'd say 80% of those, or you're at a level of 1600 plus, then you can go into some calculation training. And the main way that calculation training differs from tactics is tactical training, in my opinion, it should be quick. It should focus on spotting things. Once you've seen the pattern, you know that there's something in the position. So it's about developing your sort of sixth sense for when there's something to calculate. It's very important because you can waste a lot of time calculating things when you shouldn't be calculating anything. Like, for example, in the starting position, there's nothing to calculate here. You just play whatever opening you play. You don't calculate like knight f3, my opponent could go knight c6, my opponent could go knight a6. You know, positions like the starting position are completely non-forcing. So calculating things is a total waste of time. You waste so much time. So when you get to this sort of stage, despite its what it's called, Tactical Training by Cyrus Lakdawala, I've read this book, it's excellent, more for sort of intermediate to advanced players. This incorporates concepts from chess studies, which sort of helps broaden your tactical horizons a bit. You can do visualization training, This is best done through getting collections of short games, say 1 to 20 moves, and playing through them without a board, and trying to visualize the position all the way to the end. Say stop every 5 moves or so, ask yourself how many pieces are left, where are the pawns, where are the kings. Try to visualize, because the way that people visualize generally in chess is nobody visualizes the whole board the whole time. I think that's a myth. I think people visualize small sections of the board, and being able to do this accurately is important for developing calculation skills, because once you get 3, 4, 5 moves into the position, it will become blurry. So if you get to a point where it's blurry, just try to push yourself that a little bit past the blur, and then over time, by persistently banging your head against that barrier, you will develop an ability to calculate deeper and visualize more accurately. So that's those 2 things. And then the third one, if you want to really get deep into calculation theory, there's probably no better teacher than Grandmaster Jacob Agard, who published several excellent books. But there's, in particular, his Grandmaster Preparation Calculation, although extremely difficult, breaks down chapter by chapter what you can use, calculation tools, things like candidate moves, which is a kind of a more basic one, all the way down to comparison, prophylaxis, advanced themes, such as that, and lots of puzzles to go with them. Very, very difficult book, though. You have to really be prepared to work hard with that one. I completed that book during the pandemic, and I saw an incredible boost in my strength at that point. But the thing with calculation and tactics training is you have to keep training it. Otherwise, eventually the skill kind of goes away. So that's all well and good. That's how to do it. Sorry, that's how to improve at it. How do you actually do it? So I like having a structured thought process. And I'll go through this in the examples. And the first thing I ask myself is, what is my opponent's threat? The second thing I do is there anything immediately obvious? Okay. The third thing is what Surya Ganguly calls the overview. He's also an excellent teacher of calculation. In fact, the Indian school of calculation is generally regarded as probably about the best. Players like Pragnanandha, Gukesh, Arjun Erigaisi, Aryan Chopra, Nihal Sarin, all of those strong Indian GMs have come out of Ramesh, his school of calculation. And this kind of calls for an overview. So you calculate possibilities and you go 2 to 3 moves deep. And this sort of gives you a flavor of all the tactical possibilities in the position. And then once you've done your overviews, you go deeper into the forcing moves. And then fifth thing, make an evaluation when the position no longer forcing. So when there's no checks, captures, threats, or forcing moves available, then it's time to evaluate. And the fifth thing I want to just cover on a little bit is time. Obviously, you only have a finite amount of time for a chess game, so it's very important to calculate at certain points. And these are typically called critical positions. But how do you tell whether a position is critical or not? As I've said, the start position is not a critical position. Some guidelines that I like to go by is if your opponent threatens something that you must respond to. Most basic things, somebody attacks a piece of high material, so say somebody like the opponent puts a bishop on g4 attacking your queen, you kind of have to respond to that, or makes a check to the king. When your opponent captures something, you've got multiple options for recapture. You should pause. You don't always have to recapture. There might be a stronger counter threat available. In the opening, generally, it's good to have a think when you're out of theory, but not always to calculate, just have a general look around the position and assess when your opponent makes a new move, for example. It can often be helpful, actually, on your score sheet to record this moment. So you come back to it after the game, and it's important for increasing your understanding of the opening as well. And when your opponent makes a move you don't expect, you should definitely calculate it here as well. Okay, and typically you'll get 2 to 3 critical positions in a game, which require 10 to 15 minutes thinking time each, as a rough guide. And as we get an hour for each game, that's 45 minutes. And the rest of the time is to conduct the non-critical decisions. Okay, I like to calculate using what I call the CCTV approach, which is an abbreviation that stands for checks. So the most forcing moves in any position is a check, because your opponent has to respond to it, as per the laws of the game. So look at all the checks, even the really stupid ones, because sometimes surprising moves can be the answer. And quite often in puzzle books, you'll see spectacular checks like queen takes f7 and queen h8 check being correct. Then the next C in CCTV is for captures. Any capture by any piece, regardless of how ridiculous it looks, should be considered at least, if not calculated, to a point where you know that you can either eliminate it or go through it in more detail. T is for threats. So this can be anything from threatening to win a higher value piece or to threaten a checkmate. Threat should always be looked at. And the V is for evaluation. So this is the point when you've calculated all the checks, captures, threats, and you've got to a position either where you can't calculate any further or where it's non-forcing, to evaluate and place a, white is better, black is better, or these elements are better for white, these elements are better for black. And it's always important to compare your evaluation of the final position with what you thought in the initial position. Say if you think you should have a crushing attack and you calculate a line and you think the position is equal, then it most likely indicates either your initial judgment's wrong or you missed something. So it's worth going back and rechecking your calculation if your evaluation is off. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to go through 10 examples from my own games, which I've given sort of slightly humorous titles, and they kind of go from, generally speaking, chronological order, and I've started with examples of things I've missed, which is just the nature of the game. Right, first one I want to cover is a game I played back in 2022 against a strong player, Mikhail Sedik. The game started out as a King's Indian. I'm going to go through really quickly. It's not a particularly important, but we got to a Benoni structure. I did the correct thing here, exchanging a pair of minor pieces. And we can see that I don't really play with a great deal of purpose. F4 is a very ambitious move, actually. Not necessarily best. And I'm not saying that this is a particularly high quality game. I made some threats. My opponent generally played quite well here, pushed me back. There were a lot of times in this game, I'll just point out one strategic theme where this move was crying out to be played to give the knight the c5 square, but like I say, I was fairly new to the King's Indian and not really understanding where I should be putting the pieces. Okay, we're coming up quite fast on the critical moment, so the game is sort of balanced here. So first of all, why is this a critical moment? I mean, you could argue there are a couple of critical moments in the preceding moves as well. D6 is critical because my opponent has a very big threat here. He wants to play D7, so I'm responding to the threat. And from memory, I was in a bit of time trouble in this game. And I played along the lines of what I thought was a good way to play. Now, you've got to ask yourself here, what is white's big threat? And it should be kind of obvious that your big threat for white here is they want to take here, capture this knight, and then checkmate me somehow on the f-file. The f7 square, essentially, is extremely weak. And this is kind of what happens in the game. So first thing I didn't do very well here was threat detection. And although the move I made makes some sense, it's not really a forcing move. So I played a completely non-forcing move in a forcing position, which is probably a bad idea. Okay, so let's go through our thought process here. Checks, captures, and threats. So first of all, white's king is very safe. Despite the open nature, here my king is in a lot more danger, and there are no checks, actually, I can deliver. So you can see, quick check, no checks. Captures. Not much I can capture. There is rook takes d6, which would be one candidate move. I'm going to take some of this paint off the board. So I'm just going to say that this is white's kind of big threat. These are white's threats. So no checks. Captures. I mean, I can eliminate fairly quickly this move because it just looks very bad. As soon as the queen recaptures on f5, there's a mate, a close to mate threat on h7. And this just looks extremely stupid. So you wouldn't play g takes f5 in this position. You almost certainly wouldn't play rook takes d6 either because you just lose a full rook. So I can check. I've checked all of this in about a minute. So this brings me on to threats. So can I make a threat? Is the question. And the answer is yes, I can make a threat. I can threaten white's queen with e4. I'm going to clear all the paint off as well, so we're going to need to calculate, and in order to do that we need no paint. So e4 should certainly be considered, but because at this time in 2022 I'd just come back to playing again, I wasn't really thinking in a very structured way in this game. I was also in a little time trouble, which never helps. Pawn to e4 to me now is such an obvious move that should be considered. And we can go a little bit further here. So we go pawn to e4. So what's the idea? So first of all, white needs to move the queen. And ideally we'd like to keep the queen on the f-file, but we notice if we look closely that queen to f4 loses immediately to bishop e5 with this pin. Okay, so that's fairly easy, straightforward. Okay, so what else can white do? Again, queen g3 has sort of the same problem. This bishop e5 pin will win. So queen g2 becomes an option, but this looks extremely unattractive for white. And in fact, if white does that, they lose control of the e3 square, and I'll play pawn to e3, hitting the bishop, and when the bishop moves, at the very least, I have pawn to e2, which creates a double attack on both rooks and forces white to capture with the knight, after which I play rook takes e2, and they should be winning there. This line, what have we calculated? So we calculated e4, we've looked at queen e3, bishop e5, we've assessed. You see we've stopped at this point and said black is winning, there's no counterattacks. White just loses the queen. With queen g2, I'm saying that e3 is winning. We can go a little further here because there is still a forcing moves available here. In fact, bishop e1 may be a defense here. Because we x-ray the queen, and after e2 we can take. But I mean, at the very least here, you can put the knight on d2. But this is sort of overview stage that we're in, right? So queen g2, we know e3 is an option, and then we have a think here. Maybe we'll revisit this. But I suppose the critical test here is what happens if white takes. So we look at the captures. So first of all, queen takes is ridiculous because we just take the queen and black wins. We look at bishop takes. But then we may notice this option, bishop takes c3, when this bishop hangs. So say recapture here, and then say for example knight takes e4, black should be winning here. The only thing to look at here is what f takes g6 gives white anything, and I think the answer is a sort of resounding no. We can recapture with the f pawn, and because black, maybe white can, maybe if you were calculating here, you'd say, okay, maybe fg6 is an option here, I'll come back, but this looks winning for black. So we can eliminate bishop takes e4 quite quickly. So knight takes e4. Now this is the point where we really need to calculate. So we're going to play knight takes e4. We're going to play bishop takes e4. And then in this position, I should probably come up to the top here actually. So we see that knight takes e4 is most likely. Knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. Has black got a good move here? I'll give you a second. So this is all about visualization, a skill which I hadn't adequately developed at the time. Okay, now I've had a think. There's a bishop on e4, a queen on f3. This piece is gone. This pawn is gone. Black has the killing move, knight d2, in this position. So this, in fact, would have been certainly better for black, if not winning. I think the line probably continues here. Like white, for example, has to play rook takes d2, queen takes d2. But we can see we're now threatening to eliminate on d6. So after fg6, for example, I mean, even queen d6 here is probably fine. Well, no, it's not. You'd spot bishop g3 and then you'd reevaluate. So you want to take the pawn here. And then say black wants this. But then we can see that black is clearly winning here. But after e4, is there anything better? We can see that bishop takes e4 is the computer suggestion. And then we would calculate bishop takes c3, right? But we may, if we're careful at this point, consider all the captures and consider f takes g6 is actually a big problem. Okay, so we would reject bishop takes c3 at this point. After bishop takes e4, we say, okay, we have to take knight takes e4, knight takes e4. And then we'll spot the theme, as before, to take here and play knight d2 with a double attack and a better position for black. After the best line, here, and queen e5 check, I assume, or queen takes f5, eliminating the danger. So you get to this point in your thought process. There's only 4 moves deep, and you can see that material is equal, but it's now the white king that is wide out in the open. White has a lot of weak pawns, and black should be better here, / winning. Okay, so it's quite a complicated example to start off with. Let's see how the game went. So after f5, I failed to appreciate this. I made a threat, which white easily eliminated, and then carried out their main idea. And after fg6, bishop takes g6 was played, and I actually blundered here. Again, calculation would have been quite helpful here, but in massive time trouble, I decided that rook f8 was a good move, but I overlooked a simple check. Had I taken here, actually, there is no win for white. White probably has a perpetual here if we go queen f7, king h8, queen g6. I can't prevent this perpetual mechanism. Queen h5 check and then queen back to f7. So I should probably play something. I think this doesn't really matter. White's to play here, queen h5 check actually wins. So the reason that knight d3 is a good move is because it stops in this position. If white has g6, they win. But here we it just loses the queen. So the difference with what I played was rook f8, and then we see this mechanism. White executes king g8, g6. Black can resign. In fact, that's what I did. So a painful experience. Moving on to more pain. This is a kind of crazy game that I played against Jude Shearsby, who's now an FM and a strong player. It was about 6 months before he got to FM level, and he had a think here, right? And he played, after 10 minutes, he played knight takes d6, which, sure, looks pretty sensible. I can't take here. This is check. And then the king has to run to the c file. His basic point is if I take here, there's a check, king c7, then something to c1, and that's game over. But I actually played the right move here. I took on h3, and after knight h2, I resigned. Because I assumed that I am getting checkmated here, which is not actually correct. So what I could have done here is looked around for checks, captures, threats. First of all, the check. Completely useless. Queen takes knight, and queen g2, or queen f1, all lose the queen for no compensation. So we can eliminate those. Threats. Sorry, captures. Now, there are a couple of captures that look quite interesting here. Rook takes g5 looks quite interesting, for starters. There is a bit of a problem with that, unfortunately. I mean, first of all, knight takes f7 check as a minimum, wins the rook. It doesn't look great, and also chases the king to the c file, where it's probably going to get mated. So captures rook takes g5 does not look so good either. But you can see how needing to spot these basic tactical patterns is important. I'll colour those in red. So this is my thought process. I didn't do any of this in the game, by the way. I just resigned here, which is a bit sad. So then we have to ask ourselves, are there any threats? White's king's quite weak. So that kind of brings another candidate into mind, namely knight g4. We attack the pin piece and we threaten mate in 1. So that's knight g4. And after knight g4, what does white do here? It's not too difficult to conclude there are 2 checks. This third check obviously is the queen. So let's say, for example, bishop takes e7 check. Now this looks like a really bad move, actually. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is losing for white. Because king takes e7, I'm threatening to take this knight. My king's now quite well covered. There are no more checks for white. So we can conclude that black is winning here. Because queen h2 is unstoppable, in fact. Okay? So if knight g4, what does white do? White, see, what I thought was my opponent's intention was knight b7 check, and I noticed I can't go here. So I have to go king c7, for example. And I concluded rook c1 check, king say to b8, for example, and that white has some check here, and I was mated. But in fact, that's not true, because the knight is in the way, and there is no queen check on the b file because of the presence of the knight. So in fact, in this position, black is winning too. So you can see how important it is to calculate accurately. So that leaves, in fact, we've missed something. If we go bishop e7, king e7, that leaves, this is not indeed winning. This is in fact equal. That leaves knight 5 check as the way for white to proceed. Now, I think you can calculate rather easily that you don't have many moves here with black. You have king d8, you have king f6. King f6 is very risky and should lose fairly routinely after queen c6 check. There is only king g5 available. White has f4 check, for example, which is quite a nice move. Not so easy to spot, actually. F4 check. And then if ef4, the point is there is this rather beautiful checkmate here, which is, well, sorry, after f4, white can defend, and black should be mated here in short order. That's the point. Okay? So I'll take that evaluation off because that's not right. And if black runs the other way with king d8, then white has queen a5 check. It looks like crossing the c file is suicide, so yeah, king e8. If king c8, we can conclude quite quickly that rook to c1 with check will win. So we would calculate this and say that white is winning. But if we make the other king move, king e8, in fact, there is no way for white to win this position. The best that white can do is queen a4 check and queen a5 with perpetual. So I threw away half a point here because I didn't calculate anything. Hence the chapter name, never trust your opponent, no matter how strong they are. They make mistakes. Jude made a big mistake with knight takes d6. After king d8, you can see that a sensible move like king h2, stopping the counterplay. It's another key part of calculation is prophylaxis. After king h2, then yeah, bishop takes f6, knight takes d6. Knight takes d6 is the winning threat. So Jude could also have benefited from a bit of prophylactic thinking here. Okay. Something else that when I played, I actually had a very promising, because my opening preparation is generally very good. I played against Martin Rafe, who's a strong FM, and this is in the Northumbria tournament in 2022. The same game tournament actually that the Bad Complications game comes from. And I'd actually played quite a reasonable opening here, and got my opponent in a sort of awkward situation with king f8 And maybe h3 isn't the best here. Maybe I should prefer something else. But also very reasonable h3. And he actually wants him to not retreat knight f6. I mean knight a3 here, which is a bit silly, but it's kind of the same idea. Bishop f5, and I played knight b5 here. Which is quite challenging because I'm threatening to take my pawn back to number 1. But I thought black's reply here is quite obvious. I mean, he has 2 candidate moves as far as I could see, or perhaps you could say 3 candidate moves. You can consider queen b4. You can consider queen d7. And you can consider queen c5, which is what I played in the game. And I really failed to appreciate the difference between any of these moves, basically. And when a strong player spends 35 minutes thinking about something, normally there is something to think about. It's not always the case, but quite often it is worth thinking about. So, what was my opponent thinking about here? Well, there are no checks for him. Captures, there are not very good captures available. My bishop takes c2 is the only one I can see. So that leaves threats. So let's go queen d7 first. Queen d7, perhaps my opponent didn't like the simple capture. Yeah, a simple capture, and compared to king safety, I'm just much better here. I think at the f knight, it wants the b knight, and white is simply +2 here. It's amazing, really. So my opponent was trying to pull the plug here, which is a concept we'll come back to. Queen b4 also doesn't impress me a great deal. At the very least, here again, I can take on d4. But b3 is also good. b3 is, in fact, what I played in the game. But I failed to appreciate the difference here between b3, which is losing all my advantage, what I played, and a much stronger move. Queen c5, what was my opponent thinking about? That's the question. First of all, can I take this? Was what he was thinking. And I don't know, take this. Queen c4, knight f5, that's fine. That white should be winning here. Certainly much better. Yeah, the white maintains the advantage. But that wouldn't have taken him 35 minutes to figure out. So, if not, knight b takes d4, if not, queen takes c4. Because this is indeed the correct move here. Knight b takes d4. He was, in fact, as he told me after the game, calculating this move, rook d8. And this suddenly looks like a great deal of trouble for white. Both pieces are threatened. So what to do? And the answer, which is what my opponent was calculating or trying to evaluate, is the fantastic move knight takes c6, which hadn't even crossed my mind, but can be found by using a good calculation thought process. And all of a sudden here, I would say that black is the one that has to be careful. The knight takes c6, takes d1, takes d1. What about this? Looks good, right? In fact, it is not a good move because you can go rook d8 check. And this also looks fine initially if you calculate knight e8. But white has the crushing move here, knight d4, I believe, or knight e5. Knight d4 also works. Knight d4 is also pretty good. But essentially, yeah, the simple deflection. And if the queen, say, moves away, oops, checkmate. So this is what my opponent was calculating, and something that I completely failed to overlook. And the rest of the game is a case of stronger player outplaying weaker player. In fact, here I'm already quite awkwardly placed, and I gave the second pawn and got easily outplayed here. Yeah. So you can see how important calculation is. Okay, this is a game played in 2023 at the Coventry Open, where I was playing Stephen Jones, who's a teammate of mine. And I actually surprised him with a new line. And he played in typical Stephen Jones fashion, very ambitiously. But I got some nice pressure here after e4, bishop b4. And he has to make this awkward move, rook f6. After castling, he played knight e5, which is very ambitious. This is the kind of move Stephen wants to play. Because he's now wanting to do this f4, f3. And I went wrong here. Well, I didn't just go wrong. I missed a win here. Is quite simply, yeah, knight b6 is the lazy move and something I played quite quickly, but I completely missed the simple question: what if I take this knight? If I take this knight, the answer is on d6, and now two moves which aren't so difficult to calculate. Bishop f8. Simple queen d5 check, picking up the e5 pawn, at the very least, with a massive position. Also after king h8, I can play bishop c4 most likely, which gives some threats. Sorry, not bishop c4. I can simply take the e5 pawn, which is not difficult calculation. But a more critical question is what happens if he takes, which looks like it wins a pawn, but in fact does not after queen d5 check, king h8. I just quite simply win the bishop on the pin. This bishop e6 covers up the protection, and I win a whole piece. So yeah, would have been winning. Okay. Now I am going to cover a position which is very painful. It's something I had prepared. This is in 2024, this game in the Blackpool Open, and this is something that I'd had some help preparing for. So my coach and I prepared this position. Suraj played in exactly the same way as he did before. We knew that this was correct, and then we came up with this move, which is the best move in the position. It's a slightly surprising move, but Suraj played a very obvious reply, played knight b4. I knew that the best move, according to the computer, was this. And then I was supposed to go queen g3, and white's supposed to be a little better here. But why is this, which is such a natural move, a mistake? Not at all obvious. Not at all obvious. And I spent 45 minutes here and came up with the pathetic rook d1, which loses the bishop pair and allows him to trade pieces. I can't really stop this, is the problem. And bishop d1 has its problems as well, because there's knights hopping into d3, and this pawn is hanging. So this is not so much a checks, captures, threats type position, although the move itself is quite deep here, actually. It's kind of preventing his threat. So the move to play here, or an advantage for white, is knight b5. Quite a difficult one. Knight c2. The point is that queen takes a5, and white gets a crushing initiative, which the computer will confirm. Knight takes a1, I think there's even d5, which is completely crushing. Maybe the check first, then d5. And the point is I'm taking bishop b6. Delivering the checkmate somewhere. I think even here is probably quite good. Yeah, they can't take, for example, because that's mate. So, again, calculation. Rook d1, it's a tiny advantage. Queen e1, knight b4, knight b5 gives a massive advantage. So it's these kind of decisions that you have to get better at. Another thing that calculation is very useful for is, I'm going to move to slightly less severe examples, is what I call the fire extinguisher, which is like when you're in trouble putting out the fire in a position. for want of a better word. So we come to a position I had in the British Championships in a game against an FM Michael Doherty, and he's kind of starting to take over here. I've started the combination off with F5, Queen E5, and if I let him get his Queen to D5, and he starts to generate threats around my king, it can be very bad news. So it's this position. I played A4 here, which is, you see, I thought he was threatening bishop B5, so it does address his threat. It certainly is a threat. I won't deny it, but there's a better move, a much stronger move. So again, let's go through the process. Checks. There are no checks here. I can't deliver a legal check because the queen cannot hop over, and that would be a bad move anyway. Captures. I can take this. Walking into a pin, which is not inspiring. Plus, I can take it this way, which is some of the most ridiculous move I've ever seen, but it's not a very good move. I mean, at the very least here, black can take with the rook and have a very nice position, but can probably, yeah, can do this and this and this. And this is probably just winning. So we did a quick overview there and determined that this is a bad capture. Much the same sort of thing happens after knight takes d4. Although in that particular position, we'll probably just take everything on d4 and here, and it should be better for black. These are just overviews, so it's important to do this quickly. So yeah, after queen e5, are there any other, there are no more captures, but are there any other forcing moves? I could try bishop b6, but yeah, bishop, it's not really more of a threat than bishop b5. He'd probably go bishop b5 anyway, and this should be a winning threat. He can also just move the rook at some point, probably. So yeah, this looks also good for black. But after bishop b6, yeah, bishop b6 would also be quite good. a4 is not great. But there is this little move, and the computer's now pointed out, f6, which is, bishop b6 is okay. We can conclude that this is a decent candidate move as well, considering that bishop b5 doesn't work so well, but f6 is a superb move. He cuts danger out of the position. So black can't allow this pawn to keep going, so it has to take, and the calculation here is not so difficult. We take the rook, we take here. Oh, there's a pin. You have to take. We take like this. Take, take, and we get a position where white's winning actually. So there's a better way of defense for black. Takes, rook takes, queen takes. A bishop d4 is king g8. Okay, so not bishop d4, but queen c4, d3. Sorry, this is how we get there. Bishop d4, take, take. Nope, not this. Knight takes d4. When you get this position that is unclear but roughly equal. So yes, this was again my sort of last opportunity to bail out, and after this I got outplayed. Quite simply, again, there's a bit of a time trouble issue here. Yeah, black just won like this. Quite straightforward. But f6. We find out at f6 or bishop b6, you're doing quite well here, but f6 is the cleanest. Okay, next game is a game I played in the English Championships against Peter Wells, and I actually found the right move here. So Peter's he's starting to take over a little bit here. First things first, I have an isolated queen's pawn, which is not a big deal, but he's also starting, he controls the only open file on the board. He has nice active pieces, pair of bishops, nice knight. So I kind of have to mix it up here. And so my next move is actually very good. I don't have any checks or captures that are good, but knight e5 takes, takes. And Peter bails out of the critical line here. He's kind of considering the bishop g2 is the move that you have to consider here, because he's creating a lot of threats around the king. But the move I had seen here is e6, which opens up the dark squares around the king and creates a highly unclear position, which Peter was already in time trouble, didn't want at all. This is an excellent move, knight e5. It's the only move that keeps the balance for white. Put the line on, you say you play anything else. They play a nothing move. Already, black's coming in with knight c4. Bishop takes f3, followed by knight c4 and doing quite well. So knight e5 is a good sense. And after d takes e5, bishop takes g2 is indeed the best move, but because Peter was low on time, he went queen c4, and I got a very defensible position. Okay, this is a bad move, which in fact Peter doesn't capitalize on. I'm trading my bishop pair for no reason, that's why this is bad. But we got to a position where, in fact, thanks to his time pressure largely, he gave me an equal position. So I stop the pawn, which is correct. I come with the king. And then this is a position where calculation would have been helpful. Now, general principles also tell you that rook b6 should be a good move. I need to cut his king out. If his king comes over, as it does in the game, I lose. But this is actually equal. And this is your chance to draw against a grandmaster, which I missed. And I went on to lose. Okay, now after 7 examples where I've shown how not to calculate or what happens if you don't calculate well, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of good things that I did. So first things first, this is from the same tournament actually where I played against Jude. I showed in the first example. And here, calculation is important because my opponent, I've just played f5 and my opponent's taken pawn. But he has no choice really. Can't take with the g pawn because I take the knight on h5. He has to take with the e pawn. And here I calculated a nice tactical blow. Checks captures threats. There are no checks, but there's a very tempting looking capture. Knight takes h7 and knight takes f7. Both have to be calculated. Knight takes f7, king takes f7, e takes f5. And I spent my time calculating whether he could do this or this here, or maybe he has some discovery. So you have to consider like bishop h4 as a move. But I think it's fairly obvious that this check is going to be winning because it's a double check and then you take on h5. So this is, oops, not this, definitely not this. This is another. This should be winning. My opponent came back with knight hf6, check, takes. And then again, we have these forcing moves, these moves that you have to spot. If you can also probably do a better job than me here. And again, I'm showing that I have a deficiency in calculation here because this check is most definitely best. But if you don't see this, it's not so easy. So I think what I did, queen g4, is also quite reasonable. He went knight f8, and I brought more units in. And at this point, it's not so much a calculation exercise and more of a everything wins. I mean, h4 makes some sense, so I'm bringing in more units. But again, captures calculated would have worked quite well here. And yeah, the rest of the game isn't so important. I, in fact, even started to mess it up a bit here, but essentially decent calculation gave me a winning queen ending, which I was then able to convert. Okay. Now, these last 2 examples are good examples of how to play chess. So my opponent, first of all, I'll go through the opening really quickly because it is important here. My opponent plays the Caro-Kann, but doesn't play in the most accurate way. So it's queen c2. The move is rook e8 check here. The reason rook e8 check is important is because it prevents me from reaching my ideal coordination. If he goes h5, which is a bit inaccurate, I'm allowed to go bishop e3, knight e7, castle long, and I can put the knight on f3. And black now plays a little bit too ambitiously and goes b5, which allows me the forcing move. Boom. And check. And the key thing here is that king h8, rook takes d5. The problem is that rook takes h5 is coming and the king is in very bad shape indeed. So after king f8, knight c6, rook takes h5, knight c4. Bishop d4 is in fact a decent enough move, but the more forcing bishop e4 is a cleaner win. There's no need to preserve the bishop pair here in this forcing position. But I'm using calculation here to determine that queen takes a2 is never a problem. And finally, I come in for the kill. Takes e6 is a nice move, and queen g6. Black is mated. Again, I've calculated here that after rook takes d4, I can just take everything and make my opponent, because king c5 and queen takes d4 is more than enough material. Is there even a mate here? Apparently knight takes d4 is a quicker mate, but who really cares? Right, so that's an example of calculation gone right, forcing moves. And then finally, probably my best example of calculation here, although it came from a position that was very complicated from the 4 NCO where my opponent actually made a mistake. So we get a position that's doing everything correctly here, where knight b4 is played, and I should just probably play, say, bishop c4, rook d1, and be happy. But I castle, which is very ambitious, bishop f5. Immediately exploits the mistake I've made. This is nasty. So I play knight d4, which is probably the best defense, I think, but it's already gone at this point after knight d4. If my opponent finds knight e4 instead of what he did in the game, then I'm crushed. The point is that he opens the c file and gets to the c2 pawn. Now, what he does in the game gives me problems as well. Knight f takes d5. But now, I read this in a calculation book once. If your opponent is drowning, throw the son of an anvil, which is basically a very heavy metal object, to make sure they completely drown. But here we can knock our opponent out with a series of forcing moves. I was quite proud of this calculation, actually. This is not an easy calculation. So, first of all, checks, captures, threats. We don't have any checks. Captures we can take on f5, we can take on d5. It should be fairly obvious that taking on d5 is very bad. For the simple reason that after I take on d5, I'm inviting more pieces of his into the attack, and this is immediately a problem. And I can resign, basically, because he also brings the rook to the c file next. So we can eliminate this very quickly. So the only other capture that makes sense is knight takes f5. However, this looks like it's losing the queen. So I'll give you the line. Knight takes f5, knight takes c3. And then after b takes c3, there is knight a2 check, king b1, and bishop takes c3, which is in fact what happened in the game. So after knight takes f5, knight takes c3, bc3, knight a2 check, king b2. Important to go king b2 and not king b1. He takes on c3. I also had to calculate this, but here I have queen c3, is the point. And after rook d8, in fact, point is that he loses too much material after this, and I can go knight e7 check and king takes c3. This should be a winning advantage. But after king b2, knight takes c3, this is the difficult thing to see, because this looks objectively this looks very good for black. Queen b6 check comes, and what exactly is white doing? This is a discovered check, and taking the bishop doesn't actually do you any favors here. If you take the bishop, then black wins with knight takes d1 check. So this is also winning for black. There is only one move for white here. The move of my opponent missed knight h6 check. The point being that if you take the knight, I take this knight with the queen. Sorry, if I take, yeah, I take here, and queen takes d1 doesn't work because I take here, threatening mate, and then this is the nice part of the calculation. You have to get bishop c4 check, picking the queen up. So this is all quite difficult stuff. It is what is possible if you calculate well. In fact, after bishop takes h6, I went for a simpler line. I thought I took on d8, which is perfectly winning as well. Queen takes c3 is about of equivalent objective strength. After queen takes d8, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, king takes c3. I'm just a piece up. And after this check, this is just a simple conversion job. My opponent resigned here, a piece down, with no compensation. But you can see how important The thing my opponent missed, by the way, after knight in this line, so I had to see this from here. So this is what makes it difficult, because this is involving a lot of visualization. From knight f takes d5, I managed to get all the way to move 20, certainly to move 17. So what my opponent had missed, he thought in this position he could go king h8, but he'd missed the rather beautiful knight takes f7 check, which wins the game because we check the queen. If you take here, I take here with check. So this is what he missed. He missed something 5 moves down the line, which is kind of excusable. But this is the line you have to cross to become a very strong player. You have to find knight takes f5, which is like the only way for white to win. Anything else you lose. Okay, so that's sort of, I mean, it's certainly a skill I can work on. As you can see from some of my games, I don't calculate that well sometimes, although in some games I calculate very well. It's more about like when to calculate, knowing what to calculate. But it's always a skill that we can work on. Doesn't matter how strong you are, calculation's always a useful skill. But it's not always useful in every position. So developing a good sort of tactical antenna by doing lots of tactics, theme tactics puzzles. I don't actually like lead chess puzzles very much, or chess.com puzzles. They're either too easy, too difficult, or just not really addressing the themes. So do your tactics puzzles, and with calculation, pick a good book, learn the methods, and keep pushing to get that half move further. And you can certainly do a better job than I can and get to be as strong a player. All right. If there's any questions on this one, I know this is quite a tough session in terms of I've gone through some quite high level examples here where I'm playing strong players up to 22, 2300 sometimes, even 2400. So if you have questions, we all struggle with this part of the game. Keep persevering, keep improving, and let me know if you have any questions. All right. That'll do for today. Thanks very much.